As with most stories, it's best to begin at the beginning, and Harvard's story begins right here, in this tiny quadrangle formed by Massachusetts and Harvard Halls. Harvard's first building, called the Old College, or the first Harvard Hall, had been built just to the south in 1638. Poorly sited and hastily built with inexpensive timber, it lasted only 30-odd years. Having acquired additional land in the 1660s, the college decided to reorient itself to the newly emerging street grid and began construction of a permanent building in 1671 along the highway to Menominee, as Massachusetts Avenue was then known. This new building, the second Harvard Hall, was followed by the now-vanished old Stoughton Hall in 1698 and Massachusetts Hall in 1720. This last was paid for by levies from the General Court, the colonial legislature, and it's this intertwined financial relationship that forms the critical element of our story. For while Harvard College has, from its very first days, been set up as a private entity, its early mission, to provide ministers for the growing population, was deemed important enough by the colonial government to warrant financial support. And the college was not only provided with direct appropriations, but also received the right to certain franchises, such as the tolls from the ferry between Cambridge and Charlestown. In addition, the royal governor and his privy council were ex officio members of the Board of Overseers, many of whose names you'll still recognize. So close, in fact, was the relationship between the governor and the college that when a cholera epidemic broke out in Boston in January of 1764, the governor at the time, Francis Bernard, moved the court to Cambridge, where it took up residence in Harvard Hall. Unfortunately, their stay was short-lived. 2 nights later, in the middle of a howling January snowstorm, the building was consumed by fire, along with almost all of Harvard's collection of 5,000 books, including all but one of the original bequest of John Harvard. Feeling responsible, Bernard immediately appropriated more than £6,000 for the college to build the third Harvard Hall, the one we see in front of us today. Governor Bernard, who seems to have been something of a frustrated architect, took a very personal interest in the construction, adding and amending to the design, making sure that the college was provided not only with a vastly improved edifice, but also that, should the need ever arise again, the General Court could be very comfortably installed at short notice. And that is precisely what happened. With the political situation in Boston deteriorating rapidly, in 1770 the governor decided Harvard Hall would be a much more pleasant seat than the rebellion-plagued streets of Boston, and prorogued the General Court to Cambridge, where, to the dismay of the college administration, it remained for 4 years until finally dissolved in 1774 on the eve of the Revolution. This move to the bucolic, tree-lined lanes of Cambridge had several unintentional effects. The first was allowing the royal governor and his council the luxury of issuing an increasingly repressive series of decrees from a safe remove. One wonders if Harvard Hall hadn't been so comfortable and accommodating, and if the governor had been forced to remain in a Boston essentially under martial law, whether the two sides might have reached some compromise. We'll probably never know, but what was clear was the increasing radicalization of the student body, which until this point had been largely removed from the debate. As the students listened day after day to fiery speeches of the likes of Hancock, Otis, and Adams in Harvard Hall, they came to increasingly support the revolutionary cause, frequently meeting under the Liberty Elm to plan all sorts of intrigues. As you can imagine, this put the administration in the most uncomfortable of positions, as the college depended almost entirely on the colonial government for its wherewithal. On the other hand, it was becoming increasingly clear that revolutionary fever wasn't going away anytime soon. So the administration, as administrations are wont to do, decided on delay. Harvard granted George Washington, newly arrived to command the colonial army, its first honorary doctorate, then promptly picked up the entire college and decamped to Concord for the scholastic year of 1775. There, comfortably ensconced in quarters about the town, the college waited to see which way the wind would finally blow. And just in time, too, for Cambridge's so-called Committee of Safety promptly forced the college to surrender its buildings and installed the entire colonial army within, some 600 in Massachusetts Hall alone. When the buildings were finally returned to the college in the following year, Old Stoughton was considered unfit for habitation and eventually torn down. The other buildings were all damaged to various degrees. Harvard Hall, for instance, had lost its lead roof, stripped to make bullets. Compounding problems were the college's dire financial straits. Receipts during the war were sharply down, and what resources the college did possess were tied up by none other than John Hancock, who, having been nominated treasurer, promptly departed for the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Despite increasingly desperate pleas, Hancock, unhappy with the college for reasons real or imagined, refused to pay Harvard's bills, nor, despite constant urging, would he surrender his post. In fact, the college's accounts weren't set aright until his death in 1793. The sum total of all this was that in trying to please everyone during the Revolutionary years, Harvard pleased no one. And in many ways, the college entered the 19th century in a far more tenuous position than it had entered the 18th. Still, a new nation, a new century. For anyone standing right here in 1800, the future must have seemed bright. But then again, who could have imagined another war with Britain in a few short years? The economic malaise that produced, and then the slow rendering of the national fabric over slavery and states' rights. But I'm getting ahead of myself, for that part of the story belongs to our next stop, Memorial Hall. From an architectural perspective, the period from the beginning of the 19th century to the start of the Civil War was not particularly dramatic or expansive. Despite increasing enrollment, much of it from the South, the college was very slow to respond to the needs of growth. By the 1850s, a new chapel had been added, Appleton, a new dormitory, Hallworthy, built in much the same style as its colonial predecessor, University Hall, another conservative exercise in granite by Charles Bulfinch, Boylston Hall, much of the same, and perhaps most interesting from an architectural perspective, a new library, Gore Hall, Harvard's only real example of Gothic revival. In other words, the college gained approximately 1 or 2 buildings a decade. Not a particularly remarkable pace for an institution whose class size had more than doubled from the colonial period, from 40 to almost 100 students per year. Certainly, there was nothing to presage the dramatic changes to come, and these changes, like those of the 18th century, arose externally. The slow descent to civil war. Harvard, due in part to the high percentage of Southerners in its student body, remained at best neutral, or at worst, openly hostile to the growing cries against slavery. As the national situation worsened, the college once again took a wait-and-see attitude, hoping that sleeping dogs would remain still once more. But it was not to be. In the fall of 1860, Northern students gallantly feted their Southern comrades as they returned home to await news of secession. Everyone fully expected the conflict to be over in a few short months. But as Harvard men met and died in places whose names have now become notorious, Manassas, Antietam, Chancellorsville, it became increasingly apparent that an entirely new type of horror had been let loose on the land. 1862 dragged into 1863, then 4, and still Harvard casualties mounted. By the end of the war, almost 200 Harvard men, the equivalent of 2 entire classes, had perished. When after the war a memorial was proposed, the cause was taken up enthusiastically by the alumni, who despite the 1873 financial panic, managed to raise almost $300,000 to build a structure the likes of which Harvard had never seen. And what a structure it was. Designed in exuberant Ruskinian Gothic, named after the famous British architect John Ruskin, the polychromatic brick mass soars almost 200 feet in the air, colorful slate roof and fanciful iron detailing dominating the skyline for miles around. A veritable secular cathedral, the structure was conceived as three separate but unified parts. The memorial transept honoring the fallen, only the northern dead are commemorated here. The banquet hall, originally constructed for use just one day a year, on class day, but soon converted into an undergraduate dining hall, and Sanders Theatre, a Gothic interpretation of Wren's Sheldonian Theatre at Oxford. Standing here in the Visitors Gallery, and this is precisely what this was, a visitors gallery, much used in later years by Cambridge damsels scouting prospective husbands. Standing here, you can begin to understand the mixture of piety, sadness, and above all, resolve that motivated the construction of this magnificent edifice, and why, when it opened in 1878, it was a nationwide sensation. People traveled from all around to view the massive hammer beam construction, just a few feet shorter than that in Westminster Abbey, that majestically vaulted what was at the time the largest interior space in the United States. They came to hear the first ever Boston Symphony performances in Sanders Theatre. They marveled at the commemorative stained glass windows by the likes of John Lafarge, Frank Millet, and Louis Comfort Tiffany. This was Harvard on a scale never before imagined. An imperial Harvard, freed from a colonial past, vying for the first time with its spiritual cousins, Oxford and Cambridge. It was not coincidental that just as plans for this memorial hall were taking shape, Harvard inaugurated a new president, Charles W. Eliot. A member of the class of 1853, Eliot had taught briefly at Harvard before balking at the outdated and restrictive curriculum then in place at the college. After studying educational reform in Europe, in particular at the German universities that were at the time inventing the modern undergraduate experience, Eliot had returned to MIT to teach chemistry when he was tapped for the president's chair. Eliot wasn't the corporation's first choice. Many feared his radical views on education, recently published in the Atlantic Monthly. But once installed, he began a program of reform that essentially created the Harvard University we know today. His accomplishments during his 40-year tenancy were immense. Reform at the medical and law schools, an entirely new undergraduate curriculum that for the first time brought equal emphasis to modern languages, science, and the classics, plus a building campaign that reshaped the face of the university. From this spiritual seat, this so very visible proof that Harvard had moved into a new age of humanity, virtue, and piety, Eliot rode forth again and again, motivating donors to fund a list of buildings almost too numerous to mention. Matthews, Weld, Seaver, Robinson, Emerson, the Museum of Natural History on Oxford Street, the Old Fog Art Museum, Austin Hall, Hemingway Gymnasium, the Semitic Museum, and on and on and on and on and on. By the end of Eliot's 40-year tenure in 1909, he could rightly boast, to paraphrase the Emperor Augustus, that he had found the university brick and left it marble. But what Eliot had not been able to address was the growing rift between rich and poor students. That was left to his last great social and building experiment, the Harvard Union.
To whom the conception of a Harvard Union is due is beyond my knowledge. But we owe the fostering of the idea to many men, and we owe the grounds to the corporation. As you see, it is the result of Harvard teamwork, of mutual reliance, the future abiding place of comradeship. And therefore, let it never and in no place bear any name except that of John Harvard. We will nail open the doors of our house and will write over them, "The Harvard Union welcomes to its home all Harvard men."
Forever bear the name of John Harvard indeed. So how is it that I'm standing in front of the Barker Center? Well, it's a sad tale, but one that began fairly auspiciously. Designed by the illustrious firm of McKim, Mead & White, whose Gilded Age creations included Pennsylvania Station and the Morgan Library in New York, as well as the Boston Public Library and numerous Newport mansions, and funded with a $150,000 gift from Major Henry Lee Higginson, the Harvard Union was intended as a shining example of social reform through architecture. Conceived as a gathering place for students unable to afford the luxuries of the final clubs, the Union was intended to be literally just that, a unifying force where pride of wealth, pride of poverty, and pride of class would find no place. Its very location was, in fact, a symbolic compromise. Constructed on the former site of Warren House, which was moved next door, the building sits precisely equidistant from the wealthy private dormitories of the Gold Coast and what was at the time the poverty of Harvard Yard, with its primitively plumbed and unheated rooms. Membership was open to all, without the elaborate initiation rituals of the clubs, and the annual dues were deliberately kept low, from $10 for current students to $50 for lifetime privileges for alumni, all in order to encourage active use. The building, a triumph of Georgian Revival design, was equipped with an amazing array of features. A massive great hall, then used as a club room, but later as the freshman dining hall, a full restaurant, open to the ladies on weekends, they had their own special dining room at other times, a lunch counter for a quick bite, an athlete's training table, where special healthy meals for athletes were served, a barbershop, cigar and newsstands, billiard rooms, where students could obtain free instruction from a well-known professional, a library with 6,000 volumes, meeting rooms and other social spaces, as well as guest rooms for visitors. It was, in fact, a final club for the masses. The only thing the Union lacked was the ability to serve exhilarating beverages. Cambridge was officially dry at the time, and if you wanted a drink, either you needed to belong to a private final club or cross the Charles into Boston. The Union was also the intended home of the Harvard Crimson. McKim had taken pains to design a custom space for the college newspaper, after officials had convinced a reluctant Crimson management to occupy a suite of offices in the basement of the new building. Reading between the lines, however, it seems that, given the dry nature of the building, the Crimson staff feared that the college might seek to limit the historically bibulous aspect of publishing the college daily. Clearly, however, an arrangement suitable to both parties must have been concluded because the final plans detail a special series of rooms for the paper, including an ornately fireplace sanctum replete with beer steins. The Crimson moved in as soon as the building was completed, and it was here FDR had his office when he became president of the Crimson in 1903. As a social experiment, the Union failed fairly quickly. As the administration discovered to its great dismay, Harvard men of the early 20th century weren't particularly interested in social equality. Despite a heady start, Union membership declined steadily after 1910, putting the institution on a shaky financial basis almost immediately. A movement to make Union membership mandatory and term bill the annual expense never succeeded. The Crimson decamped for its current quarters on Plimpton Street in 1915, and by the late 1920s, the facility was largely vacant. Higginson's noble experiment had failed. When the house system was organized in 1930, the building became the freshman dining hall, its original purpose almost, but not quite, forgotten. And so it remained for almost 40 years. Ultimately, however, either the provisions in the will expired or the college simply decided to take the loss and move on, as a decision was made to radically alter the space. The Union was finally closed, the freshmen returned to the newly renovated Annenberg Hall, and the interior then controversially remodeled, some would say gutted, in 1996 as an office space for the humanities departments. The exterior, fortunately, was protected as part of the Harvard Square Historical District. The Union's most prominent feature, its magnificent living room with coffered ceiling, was ripped apart and sliced in two to house an entirely bland and oversized stairwell. with the carved stone mantelpieces on each side of the original room now dwarfing two ill-conceived conference rooms. One single Teddy Roosevelt antler chandelier dangles forlornly in the new space, almost mocking visitors with a hint of lost grandeur. Had the planning been less short-sighted, both a home for the humanities and a one-of-a-kind venue for large student and alumni social events, something now sorely lacking in Harvard, could have been accommodated within McKim's structure, thereby preserving the best of Harvard's past for its future. But such was not to be. However, all was not lost. Change was in the air, and the lessons of the Harvard Union would prove very valuable to Harvard's next president, Abbot Lawrence Lowell. In 1909, Charles W. Eliot was succeeded by Abbot Lawrence Lowell. The two men didn't like each other particularly. It didn't help that Eliot kept his hands active in college affairs until his death in 1926, nor the fact that Lowell thought that the college was in desperate need of a change of direction. Whereas Eliot had taken a small regional college and built it into a national powerhouse, Lowell dreamed bigger dreams, a university to rival any on the globe. He understood that there were two essential factors required to build a university of this scope. The first was a superb physical plant, which was well on its way under Eliot. The other critical ingredient was a world-class repository of knowledge, which in this pre-electric age meant a library. Almost immediately upon assuming the reins of the college, Lowell set up a committee to plan for a new library system, ably assisted by history professor and soon-to-be university librarian Archibald Cary Coolidge. Lowell laid the plans for a massive new building to replace Harvard's antiquated main library, Gore Hall. Though this structure had received substantial additions in the 1870s, the first ever modern bookshelves were developed here. The structure was woefully inadequate to house the scope of the collections Lowell envisioned. As usual, however, there was a stumbling block: money. No one could be found to donate the estimated $2 million cost, the equivalent of several hundred millions today. Then fate intervened. Noted bibliophile and Harvard graduate Harry Elkins Widener, class of '07, boarded a brand new ocean liner and set sail homeward for New York. Harry, his mother and father had been abroad for several months. The parents, in order to acquire furniture for a vast new Newport estate they were constructing, Miramar. The younger Widener to increase his already substantial collection of rare volumes. Interestingly, Harry had become intrigued with antiquarian books while researching period costumes for a hasty pudding production as an undergraduate, and in a few very short years had become one of North America's most prominent collectors. Being the heir to a transportation fortune didn't hurt either. Unfortunately for Harry, the liner he chose was the Titanic, sailing on its maiden voyage. On the bitterly cold, crystal-clear night of April 14, 1912, the two-day-old liner struck a several thousand-year-old piece of ice, and 2 hours later, the ship was on the bottom of the Atlantic, along with 1,500 passengers, including Harry, his father, and over $100,000 worth of books, including a first edition of Bacon's Essays. Today, almost a century later, it's very hard for us to fathom what a shock the sinking of the Titanic was to the American psyche. The closest parallels are perhaps to 9/11, or for an earlier generation, the bombing of Pearl Harbor or the assassination of JFK. Not only had the largest moving object on Earth been felled by a mere piece of ice, shattering the Victorian myth of man's ascendancy over nature, but more sensationally, the sinking also took a large chunk of New York and London society with it. In a day before spectator sports, the comings and goings of the famous 400 were front-page news, and the loss of the likes of John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, in such a morbidly spectacular fashion, inflamed the public imagination. As horrific as the sinking was for those on board, for the college, the event was extraordinarily propitious. For Harry had left his books to Harvard College on the condition that they be suitably housed, and suddenly Lowell had a donor for his new library, in the form of the indomitable Mrs. Eleanor Elkins Widener. And indomitable was precisely the word. While Lowell would go on to complain privately that Mrs. Widener wasn't building so much of a library as a temple to her son, Mrs. Widener wasn't under any such delusion. Building a temple was precisely what she intended. And while the internal mechanism and arrangement of the library were determined by Lowell's committee, Mrs. Widener and her personal architect determined everything else, from the building's massive columned facade with its imperial front stairs to its exquisite inner sanctum, the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Room, housing her beloved son's personal collection. As an interesting aside, the elder Mr. Widener is not mentioned anywhere in this entire structure. And shortly after the library's dedication in 1915, Mrs. Widener became Mrs. Alexander Hamilton Rice. To her credit, Mrs. Widener was nobody's fool. Mindful that she was tearing down another donor's building, the old Gore Hall, to build her own memorial, she made absolutely sure that the building would never be touched nor encroached upon, presumably with sufficient penalty to preclude Harvard's off-scene inclination to ignore the donor's wishes once safely out of the picture. But regardless of how he came by it, Lowell now had his building, headquarters of what would soon become the largest library system in the world. Without a doubt, this building probably has done more than any other to cement Harvard's reputation as an international institution. For as the world convulsed in 2 world wars, and scholars fled persecution from repressive regimes abroad, the collections housed within this building and its over 90 satellite libraries became an irresistible beacon to scholarship, attracting experts from all over the world to Cambridge. And all because an ill-fated ocean liner hit an iceberg. Twin halves of one august event, indeed. Our last stop is here at Adams' house, not just because this was my house, although it was, and not just because the FDR suite is located here, though it is. We're at Adams because it's here that we can best understand the rise of the housing system at Harvard. Now, you may be wondering, what is so special about a group of dormitories? But the fact is that as alumni, we often forget how important these structures truly are, and how special they are in an American academic environment full of frat houses and ugly concrete dormitories. As alumni, we tend to take for granted the close friendships we form within our own mini-communities, the hearty intellectual life that's nourished within house walls, the intramural and extramural contests fostered by friendly competition between houses. In short, it's the houses that make Harvard Harvard. But it wasn't always like this. You remember when we were at the old Freshman Union, my remarking on how the building had been deliberately placed between the Old Yard and the Gold Coast to act as a bridge between rich and poor students. While Eliot concentrated on reform of the curriculum and expansion of the physical plant of the college, the one element he did not pay much attention to was housing. In 1900, when FDR arrived at Harvard, the college provided rooms for less than 25% of its students, much of it in substandard rooms in the Old Yard, without central heat, plumbing, or electricity. Those that could afford better soon flocked to the dormitories that were rising along Mount Auburn Street, like Randolph Hall behind me, each new dormitory vying with its predecessor in terms of luxury accommodations. Private baths and central heat were standard, along with a host of amenities. Most offered club rooms, breakfast rooms, racquetball courts, and private tanks or swimming pools in the basement. The most luxurious of all these buildings was Westmoreland Court, and it was here that a young Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with his Groton chum Lathrop Brown, decided to take up digs for their 4 years at college. The rooms, recently restored to their 1904 appearance by the all-volunteer FDR Suite Foundation, reflect the opulence of the Edwardian age at Harvard, at least for the very wealthy. It was this divide that greatly troubled Lowell. He rightly felt that a college education derived as much from what one learned outside of the classroom as what one learned within, and that the tendency to self-segregate along socioeconomic lines prevented this outside education from being truly transformative. Mixing with your peers simply produced more of the same. What was needed was something to stir the pot, to integrate the student body, and Lowell thought he knew precisely what that was. A system of small residential colleges, based on that of Oxford and Cambridge, that would create small communities from the larger student body and include members from all walks of life. Each of the colleges would be self-sufficient, with its own dining hall and library, and a dormitory system based around a fireplace study, which Lowell ardently believed necessary to encourage communication. Single rooms were few and far between. Most were doubles, triples, or quads, again deliberately designed to foster camaraderie. The lessons from the failed union were well learned. Board charges, for instance, would be mandatory. Though no one could force a student to eat in the dining hall, the fact that students were charged whether they ate there or not would have the tendency to fill seats. All in all, it seemed a perfect scheme. But as with all perfect schemes, there were problems. The first was space. The university under Eliot had sold most of its real estate south of Massachusetts Avenue, and there didn't seem to be room for Lowell's grand scheme. This problem was solved by a savvy group of alumni who had foreseen the expansion problem, and having been unable to convince Eliot to act, had formed a private company to quietly acquire land along the river until such a time when the college might need it. The second problem seemed even more insurmountable: the cost of the scheme. Estimates ranged between $10 and $20 million in 1920s currency, the equivalent of untold hundreds of millions of dollars today. A savior appeared, this time in the form of one Edward Harkness, the owner of Standard Oil and a Yale graduate. Harkness, who all his life was interested in education, had sensed the same problems as Harvard's president, and had offered his own alma mater funds to construct a similar series of residential colleges. Yale turned him down. On a visit in 1928 to Cambridge to attend his niece's Radcliffe graduation, Harkness decided to try his hand with Lowell, who didn't hesitate. The story, probably apocryphal, was that the initial check was signed over a handshake before Harkness could even leave Lowell's office. Regardless, by 1931, the first of the new river houses did in fact open. Over the years, others were built, or like Adams, put together from existing buildings, or like the quad houses acquired through merger. Until today, the 12 houses have completely transformed the undergraduate experience. Though randomization has changed the dynamics of house life somewhat, especially for old fogies like me, I can assure you that the new inclusiveness that now pervades the houses means that house spirit is alive and well, and that Lowell's dream of education outside the classroom will continue well into Harvard's 4th century and beyond. On behalf of the Harvard Alumni Association and the FDR Sweet Foundation, I want to thank you for coming along with me on what I hope has been a fascinating trip through 375 years of Harvard history.
Thank you.